it gives me great honour and great pleasure to introduce Dr. Alexander Nunn of the University of Manchester. Alex has got a wide experience in the academy, including research leadership roles and research himself. He's a senior lecturer in global political economy, and his research interests span the political economy of inequality, labour market policy and implementation, especially with public employment services, social inclusion interventions, including the use of arts, sports, participation to support vulnerable groups, policy and programme evaluation, systemic reviews in shape of policies and interventions and research methods. I'm going to keep it brief because I want to give as much time to Alex as possible. So Alex is going to talk roughly for around about 35 minutes, which should leave us a little bit of time for some questions as well. So over to Alex. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ricky. And thanks, Sylvia, Sophia, and Mariana for inviting us and the rest of the conference committee. Of course, it's really nice to be here in Porto with you in such a beautiful location. So I had a loose remit to talk about, but I think given where we've just started, I'll ad-lib a little bit, which I'm not sure I can do while I'm sat down. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm one of those people who talks and walks at the same time, but I'll try and constrain myself. That might keep the time better. I thought I might actually start by just locating what I'm going to say in my own career, I guess, given this is a conference about careers and career guidance. And it's an idea I don't often associate with. I tend to think that I've got a really good job, but not necessarily a career. And I started out as a butcher, and then I was a steel erector and a spray painter and a labourer in a steelworks. And it was only after then that I went off to university and studied politics. And it was such a cushy place to be after being on a wet and windy building site, and I was particularly frightened of heights. So being a steel erector was a terrible job, and I was forever being rescued by crane operators and so on because I was too terrified to let go of the ladder or whatever. So going to university was a really great experience because it kind of broke me out of those kind of jobs that I really enjoyed, but weren't particularly great in terms of job security, remuneration, and things that you only think about now, or I only start to think about now, like pensions and so on. And as I was doing I stayed at university. They kept giving me little bits of money to stay, but I ended up as a broke PhD student and started doing contract research, and that led me to have these kind of two research trajectories that hopefully I'll try and kind of bridge a little bit as we're speaking today. So one was around the management and governance of inequality and reproduction of inequality in the global economy, and the other, the kind of more contract research, which I stumbled into by accident, mainly for money, was around public policy and labour market policy, in particular around public employment services, which is, I think, where the big crossover with your agenda is. So that's where I locate what I'm going to do in my own kind of career story, if you like. And I should say that right at the outset, at least, I'll probably finish with a different sense of it, but at the outset, I kind of use career in the kind of orthodox sense of the term as what I think of as a kind of ideological term, actually, associated with a particular form of work, which was very patriarchal, very limited in terms of its global scope. There's very small proportion of the global workforce associated with that. And then hopefully transition into a broader, more critical understanding of career as about negotiating life course and reconciling different forms of work and production with our own kind of livelihoods and so on. So I want to start with two, I think, particularly dominant narratives right now. So the first is very immediate. And I was asked recently to give a talk to our undergraduates, which seemed a bit cruel, but the topic I was given was, where did all the good jobs go? And so I started with this kind of story then. Now, obviously, I access the news media in the UK, but I think perhaps most of us would be familiar with this kind of rash of concern, immediate rash of concern with an anxiety about the impact on jobs and the labour market from two particular sources. One, the kind of AI wave and the diffusion of AI technology on the one hand, and excessive competition, particularly from China, although I think sometimes the labelling of China in that particular way has some political undercurrents to it, but nevertheless, a concern about the spread of competition out of purely manufacturing and those kinds of industries into services, high-end manufacturing and professional services. So that's one trend, and you know, obviously I access the news media in the UK, so the Financial Times is massive on this at the minute. You know, every day there's some form of prefix apocalypse, right? So it's either jobs apocalypse, SaaS apocalypse, which is software subscription apocalypse. There was one in the FT this morning, and so this concern is really immediate, and it pertains, I think, to, or as a general relevance, but also to specific sections of the labour market, and the concern being particularly that it's going to destroy professional jobs that have so far been the kind of protected area of the labour market, which has grown as kind of deindustrialisation has progressed, and professional jobs at a particular point. So in particular sectors, coding, insurance, those kinds of services, and also entry-level jobs for young people and graduates. That immediate concern, I think, tags on to a slightly longer-running trend, which in English, you know, was at one point it was global challenges, challenge of climate change and how do you harness the fourth industrial revolution, and then it became a concern about the future of work, and you could hardly turn around for another report or another conference or another keynote lecture about the future of work, and now and more recently has become about megatrends. Megatrends is the terminology for determining this. And when you look into the literature around this stuff, you see a particularly prominent role for international consultancies, think tanks, and international organisations. And perhaps if you search in the academic literature, it's not that it's an absent, but you find less peer-reviewed research on these areas. So I want to kind of offer four responses to some of that immediate anxiety. None of these are to say that there's no story there's nothing to see, look somewhere else. But I want to start by saying some of that I think is somewhat overblown, particularly if you look for hard evidence of what this might look like. So if I just, you know, and again, I'm not saying there isn't something to think about here. I'm just saying some of this is overblown. So in those future of work reports, you would see, you know, I'll get the figures wrong, but, you know, it's something like, you know, we used to have 3.25 jobs in our lifetime, and now we're going to have 14.7 or whatever. But if you look at evidence around job tenure across the OECD, and this is not to say, you know, we sit in Portugal, and absolutely recognise that Portugal has experienced a sharper end of some of these trends than the rest of the OECD. So on some of our charts, I pick out Portugal on there to kind of illustrate that. But you look at the kind of decline in average job tenure over 20, 30 years. It's not as, you know, certainly it's there, but it's not as pronounced as some of those hyperbolic kind of reporting might suggest is the case. And of course, you know, okay, we're living through a new age of tech disruption, but that chart on the, you know, up here, that takes into account the effects of the end of the Cold War and the integration of Eastern Europe into the global economy, and then East Asia, and particularly centred around China. It takes into account the internet bubble. It takes into account the diffusion of personal computing. So it's not that there are no tech shocks in those charts. There's also a concern, and you know, I think here, left commentary is at least as guilty as others around, you know, the idea of declining job quality. We have it in our title, the kind of precarity, and I'm not, you know, I think precarity is an important consideration to keep in mind. And certainly there are sections of the labour market that were more protected previously. Our jobs as university researchers are certainly one of those. More protected and cosy in the past than they were now. 3-year contracts being a thing to celebrate, for example, and being an aspect of that. But congratulations, nevertheless, because it's something to celebrate, nevertheless, despite that context. But on other measures, you know, those jobs are more equally distributed than they were. There's greater access to those for minorities, and in particular, there's been a gendered opening of those. Not complete. I'm not saying that, but certainly that has improved across most countries. So the job quality discussion is a complex one. It's not a simple one. Automation hasn't thus far resulted in high unemployment. It has at points, there's been disruptions, but overall we have some of the lowest levels of employment in rich countries than there ever has been. And so far, so the punchline to my graduate jobs talk was, well, you know, look, this was a bunch of UK graduates, and, you know, graduate employment hasn't yet disappeared. Now, it might be that the Financial Times is absolutely correct, and over the next 6 months, and when the OECD measures, when the ONS measures this next year, we will see that really pan out in the data. But graduate jobs have not yet disappeared. In fact, graduate employment rate is roughly at the highest level it has ever been in the UK. So there are some other stories in there about earnings and so on, but again, they're quite complicated. They are certainly not the simple story that there is a decline in return on investment in education. There might be for some people in some places, but it's not a simple story of a decline in return on investment, or at least that was what I tried to sell those undergraduates that had all paid us £9,500 a year to teach them, and then give them a lecture on where did the good jobs go. And outside of rich countries, informality remains so part of the point I'm going to make here is that precarity is really a significant trend, and increased precarity is definitely a significant trend. But most of the world's population worked in precarity always, and always have done, and remain in precarious conditions. But what is, and you see the kind of relatively stable lines there on the chart, but there are really interesting things going on underneath those lines. So the way in which certain sections of population are formalising globally, being kind of backfilled, if you like, by a spread of paid employment as subsistence forms of agriculture decline, and the population in some of those countries grows. So what actually that picture of stability in informal employment is certainly true, but there's quite a lot going on underneath the surface of that is a picture of change, but it's a picture of change in the global economy that doesn't either add up to things getting better or things getting worse. That is just too simple a story to tell. So that's my first reflection then. So it's not that the jobs apocalypse story and the megatrend story is nonsense. It's just a lot more complicated than that. Second response is disruption is an inherent and perennial feature in capitalist development. Okay, so competition between among businesses to produce surpluses generates technological innovation. It generates competition in not just between businesses, but between the rest of us for positions in a changing social hierarchy. And in a minute, I'll kind of go on and say a few words about that. It also generates social struggle. And one of the other stories I was reading in the FT this morning was about challenges to regulation of tech industries because of children's safety and so on. It is certainly true that the kind of tech sector, tech's plus finance sector, let's be clear about that, is probably more powerful than other similar industries, the robber barons and so on of previous days, but it is still triggering the same kind of struggles over trying to regulate and put in the box that kind of the power of those industries. The photo on the slide may be slightly perplexing. This is a photo from my hometown, which is a very small town in West Yorkshire called Mirfield. Now Mirfield is a kind of commuter town. It's grown quite a lot over the last few years. It's a commuter town. It's got a rail station that feeds both Leeds and Manchester, two centres of service sector economy, education, healthcare, finance, creative industries and so on. That's what it exists for today, as a residential area that feeds those places. On the motorway network, it's on the train network to those two places, even a train to London now. That steeple, Dumb Steeple, was where a group of people, the Luddites, met to smash up the machines that were being put into places like Mirfield at the time, because its historical past was as a mill town. And there are still some mills left today. There are not many of them, but there are still some mills left in Mirfield today. So the continuity of social struggle, all I'm saying is a kind of a long-running picture, and we can expect more of that. And that process of competition and social struggle produces, I think, or reproduces particular social groups. It always reproduces owners and controllers. It always reproduces the need for a high-skilled technical elite. It produces a need for general universal workers that flip between roles and occupations. Despite all the technological innovation, we still have a massive reliance across all countries on relatively low-wage manual labour, and we continue to produce and reproduce surplus populations. Now, that those groups remain significant in the global labour market and in national labour markets does not mean that the same people occupy those groups, does not mean that they are located in the same places. So the shifting composition of those groups and the shifting locations of those groups is the things that we experience as the disruptive turmoil in our social lives, and that's what remakes the winners and the losers. And the thing I would say about that orthodox sense of or understanding of Korea is it's only really relevant to the top two of those groups. They're where the kind of relatively linear, occupationally formed career structures were over a very short period of time, probably 30, 40, 50 years, for a very short, small section of the global population, but even in the OECD countries, a relatively small section of the population with particular characteristics. At the points at which there are these disruptions, we see some common traits. So we see often a nostalgia for the past. So I was reading a handbook chapter on the future of work that was talking about William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, about a nostalgia for a period of craft production in response to machinofacture, if you like. And it produces a sense of economic imaginaries of what the future might be, and rival political constructions of that. So that's my response 2. Response 3 is that there is, notwithstanding everything I've just said, the current period is really significant. And the kinds of disruption that we're experiencing is actually the kind of latter stages of playing out of a process that's been going on for 6 decades. From the end of the Second World War, a process of global market integration promoted by particular leading states and particular international organizations, in which Korea featured as part of the ideological settlement. It was kind of alongside other bigger ideas like democracy and freedom and liberalism and so on, but Korea featured as part of the kind of consensual ideological makeup of that project for a period of time. And you could identify kind of different phases in that project, the kind of an embedded liberal or a Keynesian or a Fordist phase or a post-Fordist neoliberal disembedded liberal phase. But what we're experiencing right now, I would say, is the end stages of that process in which there are a variety of feedback effects being produced. And we can see those in a number of ways. We can see that in, the top left panel is UK data, but you can more or less reproduce that with slightly different timeline for most of the OECD. So that's a decline in share of everything we produce going to labour, a resulting growth of income inequality, a catch-up of some countries in the global south or global east, and a flatlining of labour productivity growth in the richer countries. I probably haven't got loads of time to expound on this, but some of the predominant trends we experience, particularly around, say, financialisation, are the spread of a kind of a logic of competitiveness through businesses, through state institutions, and right down into households. So some of the kind of my own research looks at how households themselves have adopted a competitive logic in the way they seek to organise their own social reproduction, how they organise parenting, how they invest in children, their locational strategies and so on, have kind of adopted that sense of competitiveness. Again, I need to be brief because I've gone on too long, as we always do in these occasions, don't we? So my response 4 is that there will be rival political responses to this. You can identify at least 4 kind of clusters of response. I can have an orthodox neoliberal response. The OECD or World Economic Forum are perhaps the best representatives of that. Everything will be fine so long as we invest in the right state in infrastructure, which might include career guidance and some of the trends that you open with. Some negative reactionaries, and we've seen kind of the spread of right-wing populist parties, for example, and the nationalism as a signifier of the imagined past that has been disrupted. Some positive revolutionaries, the kind of Aaron Bastanis and the idea of fully automated luxury communism in the future and so on. And some pessimistic theories about the types of social struggle that might arise from that. What I would want to do is try and point to the way in which those ideas flow through particular social groups, and I probably haven't got time to kind of expand on those now, but the kind of elites, some of the really interesting work that people like Branko Milanovic are doing around identifying the kind of intersections between wage and capital income in the control of some of the new sectors, the impacts on some of the high-skilled workers here, and I think that's what drives some of the Financial Times concern about some of this. It's coming for the accountants, it's coming for the marketers, it's coming for the coders, the people who are relatively protected by that. But there are also, at the other ends of the scale, different social groups produced by this: the digital nomads, the people mining the cobalt and the lithium and so on, and the production of new surplus populations. So I think in understanding those rival political responses, you have to kind of try and associate those with the interest groups that might be spoken to. Right, concluding thoughts then. I think we've already seen, or to some extent, an increased policy response to some of these trends. So the kind of focus on education, which was a UK phrase. It was Tony Blair, but you saw that through the OECD. You've seen that through the European Commission, and across most countries, been increased investment in education, and the workforce is far better, higher skilled, or at least more qualified than it was in the past. But that hasn't, those changes have progressed regardless of that. You see spread globally now, social protection institutions, so the scale of the global population that has some form of social protection now has massively expanded in the last 25 years, particularly because of the spread of cash transfer programs, but also now the spread of active labour market policies and institutions like public employment services, which are increasingly expected to deliver some form of career guidance to the working population, though I think it's a genuine question to ask what that form of career guidance always is. So there's an interest in the role of these institutions in managing labour mobility between sectors to try and smooth the disruptive transitions that I've just talked about. So we can expect to see career guidance have a much higher profile in that world of institutional change. Two things I would say in qualification to that are, well, three things actually. One, the role of technological disruption in the career guidance field itself. So a lot of the kind of events I've been going to that are related to public employment services are full of people selling an AI solution to that, right? And, you know, demonstrating how they can find me my next job that'll be much better, and, you know, demonstrating the missteps I've made in my own career trajectory and so on. And, you know, to a certain extent, they're not bad. I've tried them and they are fairly accurate, I must say. So that is a disruption I think we can expect to see played out. Secondly, I don't think policy paradigms have really shifted that far. You know, ideas like transitional labour markets who clearly have some purchase to try and negotiate a transition from different economic status and through different changing career structures, haven't really caught on. The idea of lifelong learning, it's there as in rhetoric, but if you try and access significant substantive learning after educational transitions in most even rich countries, that's a challenge. And the third thing I would say is as a kind of a qualification is just about resources and demand. There's so much interest in spreading, relates to public employment services, so much interest in spreading those institutions globally. They are in most countries now, but what that chart overblows and kind of undercounts in a similar way. But basically, it just says anything that's not orange, and I would argue orange anyway it would probably need some of this, but anything that's not orange might be the target for public employment services that had a career guidance function. And you see the massive expansion of demand from the black is people who are unemployed. So this is kind of traditional service group for public employment services. The other ones are kind of people who might benefit. They're either inactive but would like to work, or they're working in underemployment, which is, I think, also an ideological phrase. We mean underpaid, don't we, rather than underemployed. So the demand is just huge. And I don't have time to really do that. This is my reserve slide, but this is like different. All you need to do is see the numbers that are on the left-hand axis. This is demand relative to the number of staff in those institutions. It probably should be embargoed, but nobody will shoot me yet, because it's from a survey that hasn't been released by a couple of international organisations yet. But you just see that the relative demand, or the demand relative to capacity to meet that demand, is just hugely unequal. It's hugely unequal between different country income groups, but also within country income groups. So even within the European Union, the level of capacity to meet that demand is massively unequal. Not everywhere is like Germany, basically. So where do I finish then? So career guidance to me is like lots of other kind of professions that are there to do the social bit, right? So it's the same challenge, or to some extent there is a similar challenge to what I have as a university educator and so on, is you're caught between two things. One is caring for the person in front of you and helping them cope contingently with the inequality and the precarity and the so on that they face. How do you do that? You help them to adjust in a way that will facilitate their individual competitiveness. I call that in some of my own work a kind of idea of contingent coping. Versus an ethic of justice, which would say, no, don't adjust yourself to the competitive demands of the labour market, transform it. but maybe you won't be able to pay your mortgage as you do that, okay? And I think career guidance is at a moment where that increased policy prominence might present an intensifying of that particular ethical challenge, plus the tech disruption in the profession itself. So where do I want to finish? Well, I want to finish this. I read your opening note, which is kind of makes a link to critical theory and the role of critical theory in shaping professional development. And I guess that's where I finish up, in the sense of career guidance is a moment and a site. It's a moment in people's lives, and it's a site in which there is social and political contestation, right? It's, how are you going to adapt yourself to powerful social structures? I think open debate, therefore, promoted by your profession around career structures, pathways, learning from that experience that you have about the lived experience at the moment, which is imminent, rather than the data that I presented, which is 2 years backlog. I think you should contest the idea of career. So I think this is a moment at which we should be thinking about a broader sense of career, as in how do we locate work in all its forms, including its social reproductive forms, the unpaid forms of self-provisioning and so on, with paid employment, which is the preference, of course, of governments often and international organisations. I would say that is only possible by engaging other collective institutions, by engaging employers in their different forms, and also worker organisation. I'll leave it there because I realise I've talked too long. But yeah, that's everything I wanted to say for now. Thank you.
Disruption. Thank you for the microphone. But that's coming to an end. Could you just expand a bit further on in what sense the period of disruption that we've been going through is coming to an end and what that might be moving into?
Okay, so coming to an end is perhaps a slightly different thing to what I said, which is reaching its end stages, right? So, you know, if that kind of 6 decades process of world market integration is the thing that is driving the increased competitiveness in all its forms, that then results in the megatrends and the other things that kind of look like the superficial symptoms on top of that. If that process is, you know, now reaching an end stage, it's not yet complete, right? There are still significant sections. It's well over halfway complete, but it's not yet complete. There are still significant spaces to occupy. I mean, you know, for those of the, I mean, it's not a kind of, you know, theory-heavy conference, I'm guessing, but, you know, for those that are kind of tapped into the kind of wider kind of political economy of this, I would locate that in a kind of a spatial temporal fix to patterns of overaccumulation, which you see in the bubbling in finance and the massive financialization of society. But that spatial fix was opened up by the end of the Cold War and the integration of East Asia into financial networks, trading networks, and consumer markets, and is now, that's undergone a massive acceleration. It's not yet complete. It might never complete, but what we're seeing is the feedback effects from the limits to the extension of that spatial fix, if that makes sense.
Those feedback effects are
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. That's what that looks like to me. There is a really significant implication that I meant to say more about that I think is really important to dwell on, and perhaps does have really pragmatic implications. So, social science. So this is why I really tentatively use this kind of neoliberal word, right? And the reason for that is that encourages a tendency to think of the post-war circumstance, the kind of glorious 30 or whatever the French term, encourages to think of that as being the norm from which we have had change. It wasn't the norm. That was the historical exception. So if we structure professional interventions around the idea of trying to recapture or just purely protect that historical abnormality, then we're going to be disappointed. The future will look more like perennial disruption, less like that particular form of stability that was held in place by abnormal global conditions. And we could go into the politics of that more, but I think that's significant and important.
So if we take Mariana, did you want to question Mariana, or do you want to give it to Tristan?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of very persuaded by the idea that there's these long trajectories in history, and that there are sort of underlying stabilities in social relations that don't just kind of turn on a dime. And there's like lots of theory that we could kind of talk about in lots of disciplines that make that argument. The problem is, I think, on an experiential level, I mean, and you explained some of why that's going on, but on an experiential level, it's like everything's on fire all the time, and I feel some of that, sometimes that's being driven by the kind of elites and the right, who want us to believe that everything's on fire, so every solution has to be a kind of an immediate solution because we can't think long term. But I also think a lot of the left buy into that as well, as a kind of, it's an easy way to say things have gone wrong because everything's on fire. So I wonder how we kind of square this sort of theoretical belief in stability and continuity with people's experiential, where that doesn't chime with people's experiences, really.
Yeah, and I think it's along the same lines. Basically, the issue is that there was an expectation that was created by social democracy after the two great wars, and so that expectation is an expectation of predictability, safety, the security net, social security, full employment, and none of it was ever put into place. There was a process of development of workers' rights and putting them and safeguarding them throughout time, and then it all blew away. And what you had after that was the erosion of those rights that were conquered after the wars. And so the thing is, people are always living with reality and their material experiences and a cultural expectation, and at the same time this short-termism of their lives. So it is complicated not to experience it as more precarious, even though, of course, it's as if, for example, when we think about wealth, of course the world is wealthier than it was before. Of course there are more people out of poverty nowadays, but at the same time inequality has increased in the last decade. So, it's...
Yeah, I mean, basically what I think both of you've eloquently done is elaborated what I think our role is, right? So my role as a researcher, I think, is to unpick some of the ideological currents. And the kind of burning platform talk, Tristram, I think, is whenever you hear somebody give you a talk about how everything has to change immediately because of some existential threat, you should question that existential threat. Is it real, and whose interest is served by you believing that it is real, for sure, okay? And I would definitely buy into the sense that, and you both kind of hit on this topic, that this is not just a realm of right-wing propaganda. That is also, certainly lefty academics have played into that also, right? And we do, one of the challenges now for unpicking some of the ideology and misperceptions is challenging that idea of nostalgia. Yes, okay, there are elements of the post-war settlement that were advantageous and are worth reconsidering in terms of how might you recreate some of that for current conditions. But there were also huge elements of that were problematic. The gender politics of that were terrible, for example. That's not marginal concern. That's more than 50% of the population. If you look at, okay, we're always, so in the UK, we're always concerned about the NHS. The NHS has been privatised, denigrated, all that. That is both at the same time partly true, but the standard of healthcare is now better than it has ever been in terms of the diseases that can be cured, the interventions that can be put in place. We can see that very graphically, although I think something very immediately is going on that we should be really concerned about and doesn't get that much commentary. So we can see that in long-term living standards. They've shot up, You can see that in calorific intake. You can see that in healthy years of life expectancy and so on. Except for there's some curious things that are going on over the last 5 or 10 years, which is the long-term patterns have started to change. And so, for certain sections of the population, that post-war uplift is no longer the case. And we should be unpicking the detail and the complexity of those things. And then the challenge that really comes is how to unpick the complexity of those pictures and turn them into, and that's perhaps not my job, but turn them into political narratives that gain support for reimagining work in a progressive sense that would reconcile all the forms of work and not just paid employment being the dominant form. So basically, yes, but it's complicated, and our job is to unpick the complexity and make that palatable and accessible to a wider audience, I think.
Brilliant.